Hello, Marta, and hello, class. Today, the topic is institutional critique. So we'll be discussing what institutional critique is and how it's evolved over time in its various forms. What is institutional critique? Institutional critique refers to the relationship between artists and institutions, where artists draw attention to the institutional frame of art, often involving an active resistance to the art system. It emerged as a movement in the late 1960s, coinciding with the development of conceptual art. Artists became increasingly interested in examining the way in which art is presented, described, and sold. Some artists reveal these processes in order to open them up for public scrutiny. Others express their dissatisfaction with the hidden biases, power structures, and commercial agendas underpinning museums and galleries, examining the social, political, cultural, and economic factors that determine what constitutes fine art. According to art critic Astrid Mania, institutional critique is generally understood in relation to artistic practices that seek to unmask the structures and ideological armatures of Western exhibition institutions. So what constitutes the art system? Artists interested in institutional critique take aim at the institutions involved in the sale, display, and discussion of art. So this includes museums, galleries, and private collections, as well as critics, curators, dealers, collectors, patrons, and funding bodies. These institutions effectively control and determine the value of art. They serve as gatekeepers, deciding which artists will go down in art history and which won't. It includes people in positions of power, people whose agendas might be quite different from those of the artists. One of the most comprehensive attempts to expose the complex interrelationships within the institutional art world is Antoni Muntadas' Between the Frames. The artist defines the piece as an extensive vision of the artistic system of the 1980s. His work presents a portrait of personalities and opinions shaping what and how art reaches a public forum. Over a 10-year period, Muntadas completed a series of video interviews with 160 professionals who represent the various kinds of mediation between the artwork and the public. He divided the interviews into 8 chapters, including the dealers, the galleries, the collectors, the museums, the docents, the critics, the media, and then an epilogue in which the artists finally have their chance to speak. The interviews are intercut with images that symbolize their role in the art system, suggesting that the members of these groups regard their place in the system very differently from what Muntadas thinks is the reality. For example, collectors describe themselves as not just investors, but patrons and philanthropists. However, Muntadas has paired them with scenes of frenetic trading on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Images of a fully computerized train accompany the interviews with dealers, who avoid an economic view of their role, describing themselves instead as educators, risk-takers, catalysts, and intellectuals. Critics argue about whether they're more or less important than artists. In the epilogue, the artists themselves express discomfort with art as a form of financial and social leverage. The work blasts apart any sense of the art world as a homogeneous entity, separate from the messy realities of the everyday world, and suggests that an artwork's interpretation depends less on the intentions of the artist than on the way that it is absorbed and positioned by the art system. Of course, artists have been rebelling against institutions long before institutional critique became a fully fledged movement. In 1909, Italian poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote a manifesto for the art movement Futurism, in which he called upon artists to set fire to the library shelves, turn aside the canals to flood the museums. Dada also emerged as a movement rallying artists who were disillusioned with social systems, including the art world. One pioneer of this movement was Marcel Duchamp, whose ready-mades challenged the very definition of what art is. These ready-mades, such as his iconic fountain, suggested that it was not the object in itself, but rather the context in which it's seen that determines whether or not something is considered art. The significance of the artwork was entirely dependent upon the institution as context. By drawing attention to the role of the museum in determining the status and value of an art object, Duchamp exposes the process of institutionalization that art goes through before it's presented to the public. Duchamp originally submitted Fountain to the newly established Society of Independent Artists, which claimed that they would accept any work of art so long as the artist paid the application fee. As Duchamp was a member of the Society's board of directors, he decided to submit the work under a pseudonym. Contrary to their constitution, the board rejected Fountain, deciding that it was not a true work of art. Duchamp then resigned from the board in protest against their decision to effectively censor the work. Censorship became an issue once again after institutional critique emerged as a movement in 1971, when the Guggenheim Museum in New York censored 2 artists on separate occasions the same year. The first was Hans Hack's retrospective at the museum, when the director insisted that 2 artworks be removed. The works exposed the business dealings of local slum landlords. When Hack refused, the exhibition was cancelled. Later that same year, Daniel Buren was removed from the 6th Guggenheim International Exhibition when other contributing artists complained that his large striped banner interfered with the display of their work. I'll speak more about these 2 artists in the next video. Buren and Hack were amongst a group of several artists who often associated with the first wave of institutional critique, which, as I mentioned before, had emerged alongside conceptual art in the late 1960s. Later, in the 80s, institutional critique was redeveloped by a second wave of artists interested in the identity politics of the time. Those artists include Andrea Fraser, Renee Green, and Fred Wilson, and art historians such as Benjamin Buchloh. In contemporary times, institutional critique has once again been adapted and reassessed by artists in response to changes in art institutions and the changing role of artists and art in contemporary life.